If Naomi doesn't sit, I'm not eating. The words landed harder than the silver fork Clara Whitmore had just set down on her china plate, sharp enough to slice through the soft jazz drifting from the ceiling speakers and the polite clink of crystal against polished oak. No one moved. Not Edward Whitmore at the head of the table in his dark suit with the tie still pulled too tight from a 12-hour workday. Not Margaret Whitmore with her pearl earrings and spine straight as a ruler, one manicured hand resting beside her untouched glass of Chardonnay. Not even Naomi Carter, who stood 3 feet behind Clara's chair with a basket of warm dinner rolls balanced on a folded linen cloth, her posture as steady as if the room had not just tilted beneath her feet. The dining room held its breath. Candlelight flickered across the long table and caught in the silverware, turning every knife and spoon into a thin line of trembling gold. At the center of it all sat the empty chair. High-backed, walnut-framed, draped in a silence so old it had started to feel like furniture. Helen Whitmore's chair. No one said her name at dinner anymore, but the chair said it for them. It sat there every night beneath the chandelier's pale glow, untouched, unclaimed, as if grief had reserved it and never once called ahead to cancel. Naomi knew better than to look at it for too long. She had spent 9 years in this house learning the invisible rules that kept everything smooth and shining. Refill the water before anyone asked. Warm the plates before serving. Clear the salad forks from the left, never the right. And never, under any circumstance, sit at the table. Staff entered quietly, served carefully, disappeared completely. That was the order Margaret liked. That was the order Edward never bothered to challenge. And Naomi, who had long ago discovered that survival sometimes looked like silence in sensible shoes, had followed it without complaint. But tonight, Clara had broken something with one sentence. She sat stiffly in her pale blue sweater, her fingers curled at the edge of the tablecloth, her jaw set with the fragile determination of a 17-year-old girl who had been quiet for too long and had finally found one thing she could not swallow. Her eyes stayed on her father. Edward looked back at her. Not angry exactly, just caught off guard, like a man who had shown up for another routine Wednesday dinner and found himself standing in the middle of a question he had no prepared answer for. Margaret recovered first. She always did. "Clara," she said, her voice low and crisp, "don't be theatrical." Clara didn't blink. "I'm not." Naomi lowered the basket slightly, the yeasty warmth of the rolls brushing her wrist through the cloth. She could smell rosemary chicken, buttered green beans, the faint citrus polish from the sideboard, and under it all the clean lemon scent of the floor she had mopped an hour earlier. Familiar things. Safe things. But her heart had begun to knock softly against her ribs, slow and heavy, like someone trying not to make a scene while still asking to be let in. "Miss Clara," she said gently, because gentleness was the language she trusted most, "it's all right." Clara turned then, looking up at her with eyes too bright for the candlelight alone. "No," she said, quieter now, but somehow stronger. "It's not." And in the hush that followed, with the empty chair glowing at the center of the table like a memory no one could outrun, Naomi understood that this dinner was no longer about food at all. Margaret Whitmore set her napkin down with the kind of care that made the gesture feel sharper than raised voices ever could. "That chair is not for staff," she said, each word neat and polished, as if the sentence had been waiting in the room long before dinner was served. Naomi kept both hands on the breadbasket, though her fingers had begun to tighten beneath the linen. Up close, she could see the fine network of age at the corners of Margaret's eyes, the cool certainty there, the old American wealth that wore grief the way other people wore perfume, lightly, expensively, and without ever letting it stain the fabric. Clara looked at her grandmother, then at the empty chair again. "She has a name," Clara said. The chandelier hummed softly overhead. Somewhere deeper in the house, a grandfather clock released a dull, patient tick that seemed suddenly louder than it had any right to be. Edward drew a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the evening is slipping beyond his control and does not yet know whether to stop it or let it go. Naomi had seen that look on him before, not often at the table, but in doorways, on the staircase, once in the library when he stood for nearly 10 minutes with a file in his hand and did not turn a single page. Grief had hollowed him into habits. He still came home at 6:45, still loosened his tie with his left hand, still glanced toward Helen's chair before sitting down, like part of him expected memory to take shape and save him the trouble of living through another evening without her. "Clara," he said at last, his voice low, worn smooth by boardrooms and condolences, "that is enough." But Clara did not shrink the way she usually did when he used that tone. Naomi noticed the small things first. The way Clara's shoulders trembled once and then steadied. The way her hand flattened over the white tablecloth as though she needed to feel something solid beneath her. The way the candlelight touched the faint shadows under her eyes, making her look younger and more tired at the same time. "No," she said, and now the word carried something heavier than teenage defiance. It carried hunger, not for food, but for truth, for fairness, for one decent thing to remain decent in a house that had spent a year polishing its sorrow until it almost looked like order. Naomi wished, for a second, that she could vanish the way staff were supposed to vanish. She knew the route by instinct. 3 steps back. Turn quietly. Carry the basket to the kitchen. Return with the second course as though nothing had happened. Let the family keep their tensions folded inside expensive silence. That was what this house paid her to do. But Clara twisted in her chair before Naomi could move. "Tell them," she said, looking up at her now, her voice softer, almost pleading. "Tell them you always eat alone." Heat rose into Naomi's face, not from shame exactly, but from being seen too directly beneath a light too bright to hide in. Margaret let out a quiet breath through her nose. "This is absurd." Edward said nothing. His gaze had shifted to Naomi at last, fully, not through her, not past her shoulder to the sideboard or the wine glasses or the harmless machinery of service, but to her. Naomi felt it, like a door opening in a room that had been closed for too long. She swallowed once. The rolls were cooling in her hands. Butter glistened on the vegetables. The rosemary chicken sent up one last curl of steam into the strained stillness. It would have been easier to lie, easier to smile and smooth the moment over the way she smoothed fresh sheets or wrinkled linen or a frightened child's hair. Instead, she heard her own voice, quiet but clear, enter the center of the table. "Yes, Miss Clara," she said. "I do." And with that simple truth, the room changed shape. Edward Whitmore did not answer right away. He sat with one hand near his water glass and the other resting beside a dinner plate that had barely been touched, his eyes fixed on Naomi as though he were trying to place her in a house she had worked inside for nearly a decade. The strange thing was not that she had spoken. Naomi had always spoken when spoken to, always answered clearly, always carried herself with a calm that made the younger staff straighten up around her without ever being asked. The strange thing was that he had never really heard her before. Not like this. Not in the center of the room. Not with the candlelight catching the fine silver threads at her temples and the warm kitchen steam still clinging faintly to the sleeves of her dark uniform. She stood where she always stood, just beyond the circle of family, and yet tonight that small distance looked less like custom and more like a line someone had drawn years ago and forgotten to question. Margaret folded her hands. "Edward," she said, not sharply, but with the weight of someone accustomed to being the last clean voice in a room that had started to tilt. "Please put an end to this." He should have. That was what men like Edward were trained to do. Restore order. Shorten discomfort. Move the moment along before it became embarrassing enough to be remembered. He had spent 20 years building a company from conference rooms and airports and tight smiles, learning how to smooth over tension with a sentence and bury uncertainty under polished decisions. Yet now, in his own dining room, with the crystal glasses reflecting points of amber light and his daughter sitting rigid across from him, he found himself unable to reach for the usual tools. Because Clara was right about one thing. Naomi did always eat alone. He knew it because he had seen it once. Late in January, when the house had still been crowded with sympathy baskets and white flowers that smelled sweet enough to make grief feel artificial, he had gone downstairs long after midnight for a glass of water. The kitchen had been dark except for the stove light. Naomi sat at the small butcher block table near the pantry with a bowl of soup cupped between both hands, her coat still on, her dinner untouched except for a single spoonful gone cold. She had looked up when he entered, not startled, not ashamed, simply ready to stand if standing was what the moment required. He had told her she did not need to get up. Then he had taken his water and gone back upstairs without another word, grateful at the time that she had not tried to comfort him, grateful for the silence. grateful most of all that she had remained part of the background where he did not have to think too hard about the people still carrying his life forward. Now that memory returned with humiliating clarity. The chipped blue bowl, the hum of the refrigerator, the way she had waited for him to leave before lifting her spoon again. Clara pushed her chair back half an inch, the wood legs making a soft sound against the floor. "You all act like she is invisible until you need something," she said, and this time her voice shook. "She knows how I take my tea. She knows where my migraine medicine is before I ask. She kept this whole house standing when none of us could breathe in it." Margaret turned to her granddaughter, disbelief tightening her features. "Clara." But Edward was no longer looking at Margaret. He was looking at Naomi's face, at the careful stillness there, the kind people wear when they have spent years making themselves smaller for the comfort of others. And for the first time since Helen died, something inside him shifted hard enough to hurt. Not grief this time. Recognition. Recognition did not arrive all at once. It came in small, humiliating pieces, each one carrying the quiet weight of something Edward should have noticed months ago. He remembered winter 1st, the week after Helen's funeral, when the house still smelled of lilies and polished wood, and the front hall kept filling with people who lowered their voices as if grief were a sleeping child that might wake if spoken to too directly. Naomi had moved through those days like steady hands in a shaking room. She took coats from strangers with red eyes and careful manners. She replaced wilted flowers before anyone saw them droop. She kept coffee hot in the silver urn in the library, and somehow knew exactly when Clara needed the den cleared of visitors before the girl could break under one more soft, pitying question. Edward had thought the house was simply functioning on its own, as fine homes often seem to do. He had not stopped to ask who kept the lamps glowing in the right corners, or why fresh tea appeared beside his study door at exactly 10 every night untouched and still warm. He saw it now because Clara had forced him to. Naomi had been the pulse behind the walls. He remembered another night in February, rain ticking against the kitchen windows, the whole estate dim and hollow under a sky the color of wet slate. He had come downstairs because sleep had refused him again. The marble floor had held the day's cold under his bare feet, and the kitchen was lit only by the small yellow bulb above the stove. Naomi sat at the butcher block table in her coat, shoulders slightly rounded, a bowl of tomato soup between her hands and half a grilled cheese sandwich resting on a paper napkin. No plate, no tray, no place setting. Just a tired woman eating in the quiet after everyone else had already had their turn at warmth. She had looked up when he entered, and for a second he had seen the exhaustion in her eyes before she folded it away. "I can warm something for you, sir," she had said. Not hello, not are you all right. Just service offered before humanity. He had told her no and taken his water and left, grateful at the time for how easy she made silence. Now the memory felt like a mirror held too close. Clara was still sitting upright at the table, but Edward could see other nights layered behind her. Naomi in the upstairs hallway with a folded blanket over one arm, knocking softly on Clara's bedroom door after a nightmare. Naomi on a step stool in the mudroom, changing the light bulb Helen used to complain about. Naomi kneeling in front of the hall closet, organizing scarves and gloves by color because the house had become too tired to look after itself. Naomi in the laundry room folding one of Helen's cardigans slower than the others, as if she understood better than anyone that some pieces of a person did not stop being personal just because they had been left behind. Margaret called it good staff. Efficient. Reliable. Edward had called it nothing at all. That was the part that sat heaviest now. Not cruelty. Something colder. The ease of not looking. Across the table, the empty chair stood quiet in the candlelight, and Edward suddenly wondered how many times Naomi had passed it carrying plates, carrying flowers, carrying fresh linen, carrying other people's sorrow with her own never once invited into the room. The chicken was cooling. The candles had burned low enough to bend wax down the brass holders in soft white trails. Naomi still had the bread basket in her hands, though no one had reached for a roll in several minutes. And in the middle of that long, elegant silence, Edward understood that what Clara had broken tonight was not etiquette. It was a lie the house had been living on. The lie did not shatter with noise. It loosened quietly, like old wallpaper lifting at the edges after years of damp air no one had wanted to admit was there. Margaret Whitmore was the first to reach for what had always protected this house. Order dressed up as dignity. She straightened in her chair and adjusted the cuff of her cream silk sleeve. A tiny movement, but Naomi knew it well. It was the gesture Margaret made whenever emotion threatened to enter a room uninvited. "This family has standards," she said, her voice smooth as the polished wood beneath the candlelight. "We do not erase boundaries simply because dinner has become emotional." Naomi lowered her eyes, not in surrender, but because she had learned long ago that in houses like this, people often mistook stillness for agreement. Clara let out a breath that trembled on the way out. "Boundaries," she repeated, almost as if she were testing the word for weakness. "Is that what you call it?" Margaret turned toward her granddaughter with that familiar look of cool disappointment, the kind that had shaped table manners, school choices, and guest lists for years. "I call it structure," she said. "People are more comfortable when roles are clear." The sentence settled over the table like dust. Edward felt something in him flinch, because once, not so long ago, he might have nodded without thinking. That was how the Whitmore house had always worked. Margaret preserved appearance. Edward provided. Clara behaved. And Naomi, like the other women who had worked in the home before her, kept the machinery invisible. But Naomi had never truly been invisible. She had simply been placed in the category this family found easiest to ignore. She knew which florist could match Helen's favorite pale garden roses in late October when the season had already turned. She knew Edward preferred his coffee black before 7 in the morning, but accepted a splash of cream after a difficult day, though he would never admit the difference out loud. She knew Clara slept with the hallway light on when storms rolled in from the coast, and left one sock on the floor beside her bed whenever her anxiety had been especially bad. She knew where grief collected in this house. In the library at dusk, in the upstairs landing outside Helen's closet, in the silence after dessert, when nobody reached for the extra plate that still lived in the warmer drawer because no one had been brave enough to remove it. Naomi knew all of it because she moved through the house with the kind of attention love and labor sometimes share. Yet Margaret still called that knowledge service, as though care became less human when it arrived in a uniform. Edward looked at Naomi then, really looked. Her sensible black flats. The small burn mark near the hem of her sleeve from a Thanksgiving gravy spill 3 years ago. The posture that was both graceful and guarded, like someone who had taught herself how to stand in rooms that were never built with her comfort in mind. He wondered how many times she had swallowed her own hunger so someone else could keep their illusion of control. Clara pushed her plate away. The fork gave a soft scrape against china, thin and bright in the hush. "You want clear rolls," she said, her eyes filling, but never leaving her grandmother's face. "Fine, then say them out loud. Naomi remembers what I need before my own family does. Naomi stayed when everybody else just kept telling me I had to be strong. Naomi is the only reason this place still feels warm at all." No one answered her. The candles hissed faintly as melted wax ran lower. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven clicked as it cooled. Naomi stood in the center of that silence holding a basket of bread no one seemed to deserve, and for the first time in years, the power in the room no longer belonged entirely to the people seated at the table. Edward felt it the moment Clara stopped speaking. The room did not return to normal. It could not. Something had already shifted too far. Naomi still stood with the bread basket in her hands, but the balance of the evening had changed, and for the first time Edward realized how many ordinary miracles in this house had arrived through her, without ever being called miracles at all. He remembered one March morning, when he had come down late for a conference call, and found Clara at the kitchen island in one of Helen's oversized cardigans, pale and hollow-eyed, staring at a mug of tea she had not touched. Naomi was beside the stove warming cinnamon oatmeal with sliced bananas, stirring slowly, saying almost nothing. Not pushing. Not asking Clara to talk. Just standing near enough that the silence felt less dangerous. Edward had taken his phone call in the hall and told himself his daughter looked calmer because time was doing its work. Now he saw the truth of that morning more clearly. Tom had not been standing at the stove. Naomi had. Then there was the hallway light outside Clara's room. Helen used to leave it on at the lowest setting because Clara had hated waking into total darkness even as a child. After Helen died, the bulb had burned out. No one replaced it for 2 weeks because no one noticed except Naomi. Edward remembered passing by one evening and seeing a soft amber glow under Clara's door again, warm and steady against the midnight blue of the upstairs hall. He had not thought to ask who changed the bulb. Naomi had. Of course Naomi had. Clara wiped quickly beneath one eye, annoyed at the tears. Before they could fully fall. When I could not sleep, she said, more quietly now, like the house itself needed to hear the truth one careful layer at a time. She sat outside my door and folded laundry until I did. Margaret looked away first, which was rare enough to feel like weather changing. Naomi's face remained composed, but Edward saw a flicker there, not pride, not even surprise, just the exposed tenderness of someone unaccustomed to hearing her kindness spoken aloud. Clara kept going. When I forgot to eat, she brought soup upstairs and pretended she was checking the window latches so I would not feel embarrassed. When I had that migraine in April, she knew where my medicine was before I did. She put ice water beside my bed and closed the curtains the way Mom used to. Mom. The word moved through the dining room like a draft through an old house, touching everything. Edward's throat tightened. He could see Helen for a second in his mind, barefoot in the kitchen, laughing softly as she tucked Clara's hair behind one ear, always noticing the small discomforts before they turned into suffering. And then, with a force that made him look down at his own untouched plate, he understood why Clara had chosen this battle tonight. It was not only about a chair. It was about resemblance. Not of status, not of place, but of spirit. Naomi had been carrying pieces of Helen's care through the house one quiet act at a time, and everyone at this table had accepted the comfort while refusing to name its source. The candles burned lower. Butter softened untouched in its little silver dish. The chicken had gone nearly cold, but nobody reached for dinner anymore, because dinner had become a witness, and the truth sitting with them now was warmer than anything the kitchen could have served. Clara drew in a shaky breath, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was no longer sharp with the courage of confrontation. It had softened into memory. "Do you even know why I asked her to sit?" she said, looking at her father now. Edward did not answer. He only watched her, his face still, his eyes darker than the room around them. Clara turned slightly in her chair, not quite toward Naomi, not quite away, as if the truth she was about to share belonged to both of them and hurt them in different ways. "It was raining that night in April," she said. "The bad kind. The kind that makes the whole house sound bigger than it is." Naomi's fingers tightened once around the breadbasket. She knew the night before Clara said another word. A Thursday, wind scraping against the windows. The old maple near the side drive tapping the glass outside the breakfast room like someone asking to be let in. Clara had not come down for dinner then either. Margaret had called it moodiness. Edward had still been on a work call in Boston. Naomi had said nothing and carried the untouched tray back to the kitchen. "I could not sleep," Clara said. "I came downstairs because I thought maybe there was some tea left. I did not turn on the main lights because I did not want anyone talking to me." Her eyes dropped to the tablecloth, to the fine embroidery near her plate, as though she were reading the memory there stitch by stitch. The kitchen was dark except for that little light over the stove, and she was sitting at the butcher block by herself. Naomi lowered her gaze. Edward felt the image arrive before Clara finished painting it. The yellow stove light. Rain against the glass. Naomi in the stillness after everyone else had eaten. She had a bowl of soup, Clara went on, and half a grilled cheese sandwich on a napkin. Not even a plate. Just a napkin. Margaret shifted slightly in her chair, the first visible crack in her composure. Clara noticed, and kept going anyway. I remember thinking how strange it looked. Not because it was sad exactly, because it was normal for her. Like she had done it 100 times. Like eating alone in the dark was just part of her job too. Naomi's throat tightened, but she said nothing. She had not known Clara saw all of it. She had only remembered the girl standing in the doorway in wool socks and one of Helen's old cardigans, pale under the kitchen light, looking younger than 17 and much lonelier than anyone in that house seemed willing to admit. "I asked her why she was down there so late," Clara said. "And she smiled at me. She actually smiled. Then she got up and offered to make me tea before I had even answered her question." The rain seemed to return for a second in the room, soft and steady, hidden somewhere behind the walls. I told her I did not want tea. I asked why she was eating by herself. Clara looked up then, straight at the empty chair, and her next words came out so quietly that everyone at the table had to lean into them. She said, "Because some homes are used to being served, not shared." No one moved. The sentence rested in the candlelight like something old and true and far too honest to be taken back. Edward felt it settle deep, beneath pride, beneath grief, beneath every excuse he had ever made for the customs of this house. Clara blinked once, slow and shining. She still gave me the tea anyway, she whispered. Chamomile. Extra honey. And she sat with me at the counter until the storm passed, even though she never drank her own soup while it was hot. For a long moment, nobody at the table seemed willing to disturb the shape Clara's memory had left behind. The dining room had gone so still that Edward could hear the faint hum of the chandelier and the tiny crackle of candlewick burning low in the brass holders. Naomi stood motionless with the bread basket resting against her palm, but inside her chest something had started to ache with a strange, tender pressure she did not know how to carry. She had spent years making herself useful in this house. Useful was safe. Useful did not ask to be noticed. Useful did not make wealthy people uncomfortable with the cost of their own comfort. But Clara had reached into the quiet places and named what Naomi had never once tried to defend. Margaret was the first to move. She reached for her water glass, though her hand stopped just short of it, as if even that simple motion had become uncertain. This is all very emotional, she said at last, but her voice lacked its usual finish. That does not mean we abandon propriety. Clara turned toward her slowly. There was no teenage anger in her face now, only something steadier, almost older. No, she said. It means we stop hiding behind it. Then, before anyone could answer, Clara rose from her chair. The sound of wood legs sliding over. The hardwood floor cut through the room, soft but unmistakable. Naomi's breath caught. Edward watched his daughter step around the table with the careful resolve of someone walking toward a truth that might change everything once touched. Candlelight moved over Clara's pale sweater and along the edge of Helen's empty place setting. The untouched salad fork, the folded linen napkin, the water glass that reflected a trembling oval of gold. Clara put both hands on the back of the empty chair. For one suspended second, the whole room seemed to tighten around that gesture. Margaret half rose from her seat. Clara, do not. But Clara had already begun to pull the chair back. The sound was low and heavy, walnut against polished floor, a sound Naomi had heard 1,000 times in this room and never once imagined would be for her. Edward's hand tightened near his plate. He should have stopped this. He knew that in the old language of the house, in the grammar of inheritance and decorum and rules that had never needed to be spoken because everyone understood who they protected. Yet he did not speak. He could not, because as Clara drew the chair back from the table, it no longer looked like an offense. It looked like judgment, not against Helen, not even against tradition, against everyone who had accepted Naomi's care while denying her place in the human circle of it. Clara stepped aside and looked directly at Naomi. Her eyes were wet, but her chin was lifted. She hated when people ate alone, Clara said, and though she did not say her mother's name, it was there in every syllable. You know she did. Naomi felt the room tilt softly around her. She remembered Helen in the breakfast room on winter Sundays, waving her into a chair for 5 stolen minutes while the muffins cooled, insisting that coffee tasted different when nobody had to drink it standing up. She remembered laughing once, years ago, before grief had turned the house formal and brittle. Margaret's face had gone pale with disbelief. Edward's eyes had shifted from the chair to Naomi and then back again, as if he were seeing both the past and the present at once and finding neither of them bearable in the same way anymore. Clara's next word came out quiet, but it carried through the room like a bell. Sit. Naomi did not move. The single word hung between her and the chair like a bridge she had never been permitted to cross. Her first instinct was the old one, the trained one. Step back. Lower her eyes. Protect the people at the table from the discomfort of their own awakening. The bread basket felt suddenly heavier in her hands, the linen warm against her fingers, the scent of yeast and butter rising into a silence so tight it almost seemed stitched shut. Miss Clara, she said softly, and even now her voice carried more care for the family than for herself. That is kind, but I should not. Margaret seized the opening at once. Exactly, she said, standing fully now, one hand resting against the table's edge as though propriety itself needed physical support. Enough of this. Naomi, take the rolls back to the kitchen. Clara, sit down. The old command in her tone might once have ended the matter. It had ended countless smaller matters over the years. Which school tie was appropriate? Which guest deserved a second invitation? which opinions could remain at the table and which had to be swallowed with the soup. But tonight the command fell flat. Clara did not sit. Naomi did not step away. And Edward, to Margaret's visible disbelief, did not restore the room with one clean sentence. He only watched Naomi. He saw the way she held herself still, not timid, not defiant, just careful, as if one wrong motion might return everyone to the lie they had been living inside. He saw something else too, something he had not allowed himself to examine before. Fear. Not fear of punishment exactly. Fear of presuming she belonged where kindness had never quite been formalized into permission. You should not, Clara echoed, her voice breaking a little around the words. Why not? Naomi looked at her then, and for a second the whole polished room seemed to fall away. There was only a tired woman and a grieving girl standing on opposite sides of a truth both of them already knew. Because this is your family's table, Naomi said. And I work here. Clara shook her head at once. You do more than work here. Margaret exhaled sharply. This is becoming ridiculous. Clara turned on her, not loud, not wild, but bright with a pain that had finally stopped hiding. No, grandmother. Ridiculous is pretending she has carried us for a year and still does not belong in the room. The word seemed to strike Edward somewhere deep and unguarded. Carry. That was the right word, and once he heard it, he could not unhear it. Naomi had carried this house through casseroles and condolence cards, through silent breakfasts and sleepless nights, through the 1,000 invisible failures grief leaves scattered behind, like broken glass no one else wants to bend down and gather. She had carried Clara with cups of tea and folded blankets and quiet presents. She had carried him too, though he hated how long it had taken him to see it, with files left neatly stacked, ties sent back from the dry cleaner before he noticed they were gone, aspirin placed beside his coffee on the mornings after he barely slept. She had carried even Margaret, with fresh flowers in the sitting room and the exact marmalade she preferred ordered before the jar ran low. And all the while she had been expected to do it standing. Naomi drew a slow breath. The candles had burned low enough now to throw softer light across the room. Helen's chair stood open, its shadow stretching long over the floorboards. It no longer looked forbidden. It looked waiting. Edward rose then, and the quiet that followed felt deeper than before, because this time everyone understood the moment had finally reached him. Edward rose so slowly that the movement seemed to pull the whole room up with him. His chair gave a low scrape against the hardwood, then stopped. Margaret turned to him at once, relief flashing across her face for a brief, mistaken second, as if she believed he had finally stood to restore the old arrangement and put everyone back where tradition said they belonged. Thank goodness, she said under her breath, smoothing one hand over the front of her jacket. Edward, please. But Edward did not look at her. He looked at the empty chair first, then at Naomi, then at Clara, and the order of that gaze changed something. Naomi felt it. Clara did too. The air in the dining room had gone thin and bright, like the minute before rain begins. Edward placed both hands lightly on the table, fingertips near his untouched knife and folded napkin, as though he needed the polished oak to steady him. Mother, he said, and his voice was calm, but there was strain in it now, the strain of a man hearing his own life more clearly than he wanted to. Do not. Margaret stared at him. Do not what? She asked. Preserve some dignity in this house. Clara let out a sharp breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and Naomi's heart tightened at the sound. Margaret turned to her granddaughter. Your mother would never have allowed this scene. That was the wrong sentence. Everyone at the table knew it at the same moment. Clara's face changed as if someone had opened a door behind her anger and let grief flood straight through. She stepped closer to the chair, one hand still resting on its carved back. You do not get to speak for her, she said, and the tremor in her voice made the words even more dangerous. Margaret straightened. I was married into this family before you were born. And she lived in this house with a heart, Clara shot back. Naomi closed her eyes for half a second, not out of frustration, out of the deep, almost painful recognition that this was no longer about place settings or manners or who sat where. This was about who had been allowed to remain human while everyone else hid behind titles. Edward drew in a breath. Clara, he said, not to silence her this time, but because he could hear how close she was to breaking. She turned to him with tears gathered in her eyes and did not bother to wipe them away. You think this is sudden, she said. It is not. Her gaze flicked to Naomi and softened. Mom used to have coffee with her in the breakfast room when nobody else was up. On Sundays. I saw them. Naomi's eyes opened. Margaret blinked, caught off guard for the first time that evening. Edward went still. Clara kept speaking, the words coming faster now, pulled free by memory. Not every week. Just sometimes. Mom would sit by the windows in that cream robe she loved, and Naomi would stand there pretending she was only bringing the tray in, and Mom would say, "Sit down for 5 minutes before the muffins get cold." I heard her say it more than once. A silence followed that felt older than the house. Naomi remembered those mornings. At once, the striped sunlight across the breakfast nook, Helen barefoot on the tile, fresh blackberry jam in a little white dish. 5 stolen minutes of being treated not as function, not as background, but as company. She had never spoken of those mornings because Helen had protected them with the gentlest kind of privacy. But now Clara had laid them in the center of the table, and there was no putting them away again. Edward looked at Naomi with something like wonder and shame braided tightly together. Margaret's mouth parted, then closed. And for the first time all night, it was not Clara's defiance holding the room still. It was Helen. Edward did not sit back down. For several seconds, he remained standing at the head of the table, one hand resting against the polished oak, his face turned slightly toward the sideboard, as if some half-buried memory had just called his name from across the room. Naomi saw the shift before anyone else did. It was in the way his eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with the effort of reaching backward through grief towards something he had once set aside, because it hurt too much to hold. Margaret noticed it too and mistook it for hesitation she could still rescue. "Edward," she said more gently now, as though gentleness might restore her authority where certainty no longer could. "We are all tired. This has been an emotional evening. Let us not confuse sentiment with judgment." But Edward was no longer listening to her. He stepped away from the table and crossed the dining room slowly, the candlelight sliding over his shoulders as he moved toward the long mahogany sideboard beneath Helen's portrait. The room watched him in silence. Naomi could hear the faint whisper of his shoes against the floorboards, the tiny clink of glass as his sleeve brushed the edge of a decanter, the hush of old wood when he opened the far drawer. Clara stood motionless beside the empty chair, her hand still resting on its carved back, her breathing unsteady but quiet. Margaret remained upright, one palm pressed flat to the tablecloth as if she needed to feel the house beneath her and make sure it still obeyed her. Edward reached into the drawer and drew out a slim linen-bound notebook with a faded blue ribbon tied around it. Naomi recognized it instantly. Helen's household book. Not the ledgers or charity calendars or guest lists Margaret cared about, but the smaller one Helen kept for things that mattered only because they were human. Grocery notes. Favorite soups for cold days. Clara's childhood fevers recorded in hurried script. The florist number she liked better than the expensive Manhattan one. Naomi had not seen the notebook since the week after Helen passed. Edward stared at it for a second, as if surprised it still existed. Then he untied the ribbon. The soft rasp of paper turning seemed impossibly loud in the room. Naomi lowered the breadbasket to the sideboard without realizing she had done it. Her hands were suddenly too light, too empty. Edward turned another page, then another, his face tightening the way it used to when a contract line did not say what everyone assumed it said. At last he stopped. His thumb remained on the margin, while his eyes fixed on the middle of the page. "No," Margaret said quietly, but this time it did not sound like command. It sounded like fear. Edward lifted his gaze from the notebook and looked first at Clara, then at Naomi. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than it had been all night. "It is Helen's handwriting," he said, though no one had asked. Then he read aloud. "If this house ever forgets what warmth feels like, watch Naomi. She carries it room to room without asking for credit." The words settled over the table with the force of something too true to defend against. Clara covered her mouth with one hand. Margaret's face went still, not cold this time, just stripped of whatever explanation she had been trying to keep alive. Naomi felt the blood rush warm behind her eyes. She remembered the afternoon Helen wrote that line. Late sunlight in the breakfast room. A pot of tomato basil soup on the stove. Helen laughing softly because Naomi had fixed Clara's bad day with grilled cheese and patience while the rest of the house was busy being impressive. Edward looked back down at the page, then read the next line more quietly, almost to himself. Do not let them mistake service for the absence of a soul. No one spoke after Edward read the line. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if Helen herself had stepped back into the room, not through sound, but through the unmistakable shape of her mercy. Edward lowered the notebook slowly, his thumb still resting on the page, and for a moment he simply stood there beneath her portrait with the candlelight moving across his face and the truth settling into him one hard layer at a time. Naomi could see it happening. The shame, the clarity, the terrible simplicity of realizing that the woman his family had trusted with their most fragile hours had been asked to remain grateful for the privilege of standing nearby. Margaret sank back into her chair at last. The strength had not left her exactly, but its posture had changed. She no longer looked like the keeper of tradition. She looked like a woman discovering that some customs survived only because no one kind enough had challenged them soon enough. Clara did not move from Helen's chair. Her hand still rested on its carved back, but now her fingers had gone still, the way hands go still when they have finally delivered the one truth they were born to carry. Edward closed the notebook and set it gently on the sideboard, not in the drawer this time, but on top of the polished wood where it could be seen. Then he turned toward the table. His eyes found Naomi first. There was no authority in his face now, no polished distance, no reflex to reduce the moment into something manageable. There was only a man standing inside the ruins of an old assumption, trying to choose what kind of person he would be after it fell. Naomi, he said, and hearing her name in his voice without title or instruction made her chest tighten. She lifted her eyes to him. I owe you more apologies than this room could hold, he said. The words came slowly, not rehearsed, not elegant, but honest in the way grief sometimes makes honesty possible by stripping everything decorative away. For what I did not see, for what I accepted, for every evening you were expected to care for this family and then disappear from it. Naomi opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had imagined many things in this house over the years. A raise, perhaps, a kind reference one day, a gentler schedule after Margaret's hip surgery. But not this. Never this. Edward stepped toward the chair. He did not touch it yet. He only stood beside it, one hand resting lightly on the top rail where Clara's had been moments before. My wife knew what this house needed better than I ever did, he said quietly. I thought leaving this chair empty was a way of honoring her. His gaze shifted to the place setting, to the folded linen, to the glass catching soft gold from the candles. But Helen did not believe in empty gestures. She believed in warmth, in people, in making room. Clara's lower lip trembled, but she smiled through it, small and aching and proud. Edward looked back at Naomi. This chair has not been waiting for the dead, he said. It has been waiting for the living to deserve it. The words settled over Naomi like something fragile and impossible. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again and looked at Naomi with an expression Naomi had never seen on her face before. Not approval, not pity, something quieter. Recognition, perhaps, arriving late, but real. Edward pulled the chair back the rest of the way, the walnut legs gliding over the floor with a low, solemn sound. Then he stepped aside, his voice barely above a whisper, but steady enough to change the whole house. Please, he said, sit with us. Naomi stood very still, as if even breathing too quickly might break the fragile mercy of the moment. The chair was pulled back now, waiting in the soft gold of the candlelight, and for the first time in 9 years it did not look like a boundary. It looked like an invitation. Her eyes moved from Edward to Clara, then briefly to Margaret, who did not speak, did not correct, did not reach for the old language that had kept the house polished and cold for so long. Naomi set her hands together at her waist because she did not know where else to place them. The room smelled of rosemary, butter, cooling porcelain, and the faint clean trace of lemon from the floor she had mopped before dinner began, back when she believed this evening would end like every other one. Sir, she said softly, and then stopped. The word felt wrong now, not disrespectful, just insufficient for what was happening. Edward shook his head once, almost imperceptibly. Not a refusal, a release. Clara stepped closer and touched Naomi's wrist with the lightest pressure, the kind that asked instead of insisted. Please, she whispered. Naomi looked at the chair again. She thought of all the meals she had served standing up. Thanksgiving turkeys bronzed and fragrant under kitchen lights. Christmas roasts carved beneath laughter that belonged to other people. Quiet Tuesday dinners like this one, where crystal glowed and silver flashed, and she moved through the edges of family without ever entering its circle. She thought of Helen in the breakfast room years ago, sliding a cup of coffee toward her and saying, "Just 5 minutes, Naomi, before life starts asking for things again." She thought of Clara in wool socks under the stove light, holding a mug of chamomile with both hands. She thought of the notebook line Edward had read aloud, and how strange it was to feel seen by someone who was no longer alive and finally, by the people who were. Then Naomi nodded. It was a tiny motion, but it seemed to loosen something in the whole house. Edward stepped back another inch to give her room. Naomi moved toward the chair slowly, aware of every sound. The soft brush of her skirt against the table edge. The muted creak of the floorboards beneath sensible black flats. The small trembling exhale Clara let out as though she had been holding her breath for an entire year. Naomi turned and lowered herself into the chair with careful grace, as if she were entering not a seat, but a memory. The cushion gave softly beneath her. The table stood at a different height from here. Warmer somehow. Closer. She had never noticed how the candlelight pooled in the crystal water glasses or how the brass holders threw little halos onto the linen. Clara smiled through tears and reached for the bread basket Naomi had set down earlier. Without ceremony, without asking anyone's permission, she placed a warm roll on Naomi's plate. Edward returned to his seat, but not before unfolding Naomi's napkin himself and laying it beside her fork. It was a small act, almost unbearably simple, and it changed the air more than any speech could have. Across the table, Margaret looked at Naomi for a long moment, then lifted her own water glass in a gesture so quiet it might have gone unnoticed in any other house. "The chicken will be cold," she said, but her voice had softened into something gentler than formality. Clara gave a shaky little laugh. Edward bowed his head once, and for the first time since Helen died, it did not feel like grief was the only thing seated with them. Naomi broke the roll open. Steam rose into the candlelight, warm and plain and real. No one hurried to fill the silence. No one rushed to explain what had happened. Outside, the windows held the dark reflection of the dining room like a painting finally completed. Inside, the empty place at the table was empty no